She wore white to watch him marry someone else. Not the defeated white of surrender, not the pale shade of a broken heart, but the brilliant, blinding white of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. While 200 guests sat in gilded chairs beneath crystal chandeliers watching, Theodore Ashford slipped a diamond ring onto another woman's finger. Elena Winters stood at the back of the cathedral, wearing a smile that would haunt every person in that room for the rest of their lives. By the time anyone understood why, it would already be too late. 3 years earlier, Elena Winters had believed in fairy tales. Not the sanitized Disney versions, but the raw, complicated kind, the stories where love demanded sacrifice, where happy endings were earned through blood and tears, where the princess sometimes had to save herself. She'd grown up in a small coastal town where everyone knew everyone's business, where her mother cleaned houses and her father fixed boats, where dreaming big was considered dangerous. Elena had dreamed anyway. She'd worked 3 jobs to put herself through state college, graduated with honors in business administration, and landed an entry-level position at Ashford Global Industries through sheer determination and a cover letter she'd rewritten 47 times. The company was a behemoth: real estate, technology, sustainable energy, philanthropic ventures that made headlines. The kind of empire that shaped cities and influenced governments. Theodore Ashford was the kind of man who shaped empires. She'd first seen him in the elevator on her 3rd day of work. He'd stepped in wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her car, his dark hair slightly disheveled as if he'd been running his hands through it, his jaw tight with whatever problem consumed his brilliant mind. Elena had pressed herself against the elevator wall, clutching her coffee like a shield, trying to be invisible. "Which floor?" he'd asked, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through her chest. 12, she'd whispered, her voice barely audible. He'd pressed the button, then returned his attention to his phone. But as the elevator climbed, he'd glanced at her badge. "Elena Winters," he'd read aloud. "You're new in analytics." It wasn't a question. Theodore Ashford knew everything that happened in his company. "Yes, sir. 3rd day. How are you finding it?" The question had surprised her. Men like Theodore Ashford didn't make small talk with entry-level employees. But something in his eyes, a genuine curiosity, maybe a flash of loneliness, had made her answer honestly. Terrifying and exhilarating. Like standing at the edge of an ocean and knowing you could either drown or learn to swim. He'd smiled then. A real smile that transformed his entire face, softening the hard edges, revealing the man beneath the legend. "That's the only way to approach anything worth doing," he'd said. The elevator had dinged at her floor. As she'd stepped out, he'd spoken again. "The ocean doesn't care if you're scared, Miss Winters. It only cares if you're brave enough to dive in." She'd thought about those words for weeks. Their second conversation had happened 6 months later, at a company gala she'd had no business attending. But her supervisor had gotten food poisoning, and someone needed to present the quarterly analytics report to the board members who'd be there. Elena had volunteered, partly because she wanted the exposure, mostly because she couldn't afford to buy a dress and saw it as a challenge. She'd worn a simple black dress from a thrift store, altered it herself with hands that remembered her grandmother's sewing lessons. She'd pulled her dark hair into a sleek bun, applied makeup with the precision of a painter, and walked into that ballroom like she belonged there. Theodore had been surrounded by admirers, business titans, politicians, socialites draped in jewels that could feed families for years. But when Elena had approached with her tablet and her carefully rehearsed presentation, he'd excused himself from a conversation with a senator to listen. She'd spoken for 7 minutes, presenting data on market trends and growth opportunities in renewable energy sectors. She'd used visualizations she'd created herself, insights she'd developed by working late into countless nights. When she finished, Theodore had asked 3 questions that proved he'd been paying attention to every word. "Impressive work, Miss Winters," he'd said. "You have a gift for seeing patterns others miss. I just pay attention. Mr. Ashford. Most people don't. Most people see what they want to see, what's comfortable, what confirms their existing beliefs. You see what's actually there." He'd paused, studying her with an intensity that made her heart race. "Are you enjoying the evening?" "I'm working, sir. You've finished your presentation. The rest is optional." He'd held out his hand. "Dance with me." It wasn't a request from a CEO to an employee. It was an invitation from a man to a woman, and Elena had known in that moment that accepting would change everything. She'd taken his hand anyway. They danced to a string quartet playing something classical and haunting, and Theodore had held her like she was made of starlight and promises. They really talked for the first time. Not about business or analytics, but about real things. He told her about growing up in his grandfather's shadow, about the weight of expectations that had been placed on his shoulders before he could walk, about the loneliness of always being seen as a symbol rather than a person. She told him about the ocean view from her childhood bedroom, about her father's calloused hands, and her mother's fierce pride, about the peculiar isolation of being the smartest person in every room but the poorest. "Money doesn't make you more intelligent," Theodore had said. "It just gives you more expensive ways to be stupid." Elena had laughed, and he'd smiled that transformative smile again. "I'd like to see you again," he'd said when the song ended. "Outside of work. If you're interested." "I'm interested," she'd admitted, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "But I need you to know something. I don't date my boss. I don't sleep my way to promotions. If we do this, it's separate from my career. Completely separate. I wouldn't want it any other way. And if this doesn't work out, then we're both adults who can handle disappointment professionally," he'd finished. "But Elena? I don't think it won't work out. I think you're about to become the most important person in my life." He'd been right. The next 3 years had been the happiest of Elena's existence. Theodore had courted her properly, not with excessive wealth or showy gestures, but with attention. He'd remembered that she loved old bookstores and surprising facts about the ocean. He'd taken her to a marine biology lecture for their first official date, then to a tiny restaurant that served the best seafood she'd ever tasted. He'd listened when she talked about her work, her dreams, her fears. They'd kept their relationship private at first, both understanding the complicated optics of a CEO dating an employee. But Theodore had been true to his word at work. Elena was evaluated on her merit alone. She'd earned 2 promotions through her own skill, her insights and strategies contributing to several successful ventures. Nobody could accuse her of sleeping her way to the top because she was genuinely brilliant at her job. Outside of work, they'd built something precious. Theodore had shown her his world, not the glamorous surface, but the real machinery underneath. The endless negotiations, the weight of decisions that affected thousands of lives, the loneliness of power. He'd introduced her to his family, his mother Victoria, elegant and cold as winter frost. His father Robert, more interested in his golf handicap than his son's happiness. His younger sister Carolyn, who'd hugged Elena immediately and whispered, "Thank God, someone normal." Elena had brought Theodore into her world too. Her parents had been suspicious at first. Wealthy men didn't date poor girls without expecting something in return. But Theodore had won them over by helping her father repair his boat engine, by asking her mother for her recipe for fish stew, by being genuinely interested in their lives. "He's not what I expected," her father had said after that first visit. "He's not just rich. He's good." Elena had believed that too. They'd talked about marriage, about children, about building a life together. Theodore had been clear about the challenges, the media scrutiny, the social expectations, the vultures who would circle looking for any weakness. But he'd been equally clear about his commitment. "I love you," he'd said one night as they'd sat on his penthouse balcony, the city sprawling beneath them like a field of electric stars. "Not the version of you that you think I want. Not some edited, polished version. I love the woman who argues with me about investment strategies and cries during nature documentaries and steals the covers every single night. I don't steal the covers. You absolutely steal the covers. You're a cover thief, and I love you anyway." She'd kissed him then, tasting wine and promises in future. "Marry me," he'd whispered against her lips. "Yes," she'd whispered back. It had been that simple. That perfect. The engagement had been announced 6 months before the wedding that would never happen. The media had exploded with speculation and scrutiny. Elena's past had been dissected, her modest upbringing portrayed as either refreshingly authentic or suspiciously opportunistic, depending on which publication you read. Tabloids had questioned whether she was pregnant. She wasn't. Whether she trapped him. She hadn't. Whether she was really in love or just in love with his money, she'd loved him so completely it had sometimes hurt to breathe. Theodore had protected her as much as possible. But Elena had learned quickly that privacy was a luxury his world couldn't afford. Photographers had followed them to dinner, to the park, to the bookstore where they'd spent Sunday mornings browsing. Social media had dissected her appearance, her clothes, her perceived worthiness to marry Theodore Ashford. His mother Victoria had been the worst. "You're a sweet girl," she'd said during their first official family dinner after the engagement announcement. Her tone had made it clear that sweet was not a compliment. But you must understand the position you're putting Theodore in. His reputation, his business relationships, everything he's built could be damaged by an unsuitable marriage. Mother, Theodore had warned, his voice sharp. I'm being practical, darling. The girl has no social standing, no family connections, no experience with the kind of life you lead. She's going to make mistakes, and those mistakes will reflect on you. On all of us. Elena had wanted to defend herself, to list her accomplishments and qualifications, to prove she was more than her bank account. But she'd looked at Theodore's face and seen the pain there, the old wounds of never being enough for his mother as impossible standards. You're right, Elena had said quietly. I will make mistakes. I'll probably embarrass myself in Theodore multiple times. I don't know which fork to use at state dinners or how to make small talk with senators, but I love your son. And I'll learn everything else. Victoria had smiled, a thin, cold expression that held no warmth. Love is a pretty word for a complicated equation, dear. Let's hope it's enough. The wedding planning had been a nightmare wrapped in silk and flowers. Victoria had taken control immediately, hiring the most expensive wedding planner in the city, booking the cathedral that hosted presidential funerals, inviting 800 guests Elena had never met. Every decision had been a battle, Elena fighting for intimacy and meaning, Victoria insisting on spectacle and tradition. This isn't just your wedding, Victoria had explained with practiced patience. It's a social event. A statement about the Ashford family's values and standing. We cannot have a small, private ceremony. It would be seen as embarrassment or secrecy. I don't care what people think, Elena had protested. Then you're not ready to be part of this family. Theodore had been caught in the middle, trying to please everyone and satisfying no one. The strain had shown in his increasing absences, his distracted attention, his short temper. Business had demanded more of his time, a major acquisition deal, a crisis with a construction project, endless meetings that stretched into nights and weekends. I'm sorry, he'd said after canceling another dinner, another movie night, another quiet evening together. This deal is crucial. Just a few more weeks, and then everything will calm down. I promise. Elena had believed him because she'd had no reason not to. The doubts had started small. A text message notification that Theodore had dismissed too quickly. A phone call he'd taken in another room, his voice low and urgent. A weekend business trip that had been announced last minute, his assistant scrambling to rearrange his schedule. Who's Isabel Morrison? Elena had asked one evening, holding his phone which had been buzzing with messages during dinner. Theodore had gone very still, a business associate. Why? She's texted you 19 times today. Is everything okay? She's persistent. It's about the acquisition deal. Nothing to worry about. But Elena had worried. Not because she'd suspected infidelity, Theodore had never given her reason to doubt his faithfulness. But because he'd lied. She'd seen it in the way he'd avoided her eyes, in the tension in his shoulders, in the relief when she'd changed the subject. She'd Googled Isabel Morrison that night while Theodore slept beside her. Beautiful. 28 years old. Daughter of James Morrison, Theodore's largest business partner and closest friend. Graduate of Yale Law School. Currently working as chief legal counsel for Morrison & Associates. Engaged to Theodore Ashford. Wait, Elena had read the article 3 times before the words made sense. It was from a society blog dated 7 years earlier, announcing the engagement of Theodore Ashford and Isabel Morrison, a union that would merge 2 powerful families, create an unstoppable business dynasty, ensure continued dominance in multiple sectors. The engagement that had apparently ended without public announcement or explanation. Elena had looked at Theodore sleeping peacefully beside her, his face soft in the darkness, and had felt the first crack in her foundation of trust. She'd asked him about it the next morning. That was a long time ago, he'd said, his voice careful. A mistake. Isabel and I were never right for each other. Our families pushed us together, and we went along with it for a while before realizing how stupid we were being. Why didn't you tell me? Because it wasn't relevant. It was a business arrangement that ended before it began. Not even a real relationship. She's texting you 19 times a day. Theodore had sighed, running his hands through his hair in frustration. Her father and I are in the middle of a complicated merger. She's the legal counsel. We have to communicate. That's all it is, Elena. I promise you. She'd wanted to believe him. God, she'd wanted to believe him so badly. Okay, she'd said. I trust you. The lie had tasted bitter on her tongue. The truth had come 3 weeks before the wedding, delivered by Caroline over coffee in a cafe where nobody knew them. "I need to tell you something," Caroline had said, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by a seriousness that made Elena's stomach clench. "And you're going to hate me for it, but I'd hate myself more if I didn't say anything." "What's wrong?" Caroline had pulled out her phone, opened a folder of photographs, and slid it across the table. The images had been taken at night through the window of an expensive restaurant. Theodore and Isabel Morrison, sitting close together, her hand on his arm, his expression intense as he'd spoken. Another photo of them leaving together, his hand on her lower back. Another of them in what looked like a hotel lobby, standing too close, their body language suggesting intimacy. "These were taken last week," Caroline had said quietly, "while he told you he was in Chicago for business meetings." Elena had stared at the photos, her brain refusing to process what her eyes were seeing. "There's more," Caroline had continued, her voice gentle with sympathy. "I did some digging. Theodore and Isabel never actually ended their engagement. They just made it private, took it off social media. Their families have been planning their wedding for years. The merger Dad's been working on with James Morrison? It's contingent on Theodore and Isabel getting married. That's why it's been so complicated, so drawn out. They've been negotiating terms. That's not possible," Elena had whispered. "Theodore proposed to me. We're getting married in 3 weeks. I know. And I think he loves you, Elena. I really do. But I also think he's been trapped between what his heart wants and what his family demands. And with Mom and Dad pushing, with billions of dollars on the line, he chose her." The words had fallen like stones into still water, creating ripples that would never stop spreading. "I don't know," Caroline had admitted. "I don't know what he's chosen. But I think you deserve to know the truth before you walk down that aisle. Before you commit your life to someone who might be lying to you." Elena had looked at those photographs for a long time, memorizing every detail. Theodore's hand on Isabel's back, the intimacy in their posture, the comfort of familiarity. "Thank you," she'd finally said, "for telling me. I'm so sorry, Elena. I wish I was wrong, but Caroline hadn't been wrong." Elena had known it in her bones, in the way her chest had seemed to collapse in on itself, in the way the cafe's sounds had become distant and muffled as if she were underwater. That night she'd confronted Theodore. He'd been in his study, working late as always. Elena had walked in without knocking, her phone in her hand, the photos displayed on the screen. "Who is she really?" Elena had asked, her voice remarkably steady. "Not the business associate. Not the old engagement that didn't matter. Who is Isabel Morrison to you right now, today 3 weeks before our wedding?" Theodore had gone pale. He'd opened his mouth, closed it, run his hands through his hair, his tell when he was about to lie or deliver bad news. "Elena, the truth. For once, just the truth." He'd looked at her for a long moment, and she'd seen the exact second he'd decided to stop lying. "She's my wife." The words had hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that would consume everything. "What? We got married 2 years ago. A private ceremony, just family. It was necessary for the merger, for the business. But it wasn't real, Elena. It was legal paperwork. Nothing more. I don't love her." "I love you." Elena had felt her legs go weak. She'd sat down on his leather couch because standing had suddenly become impossible. "You've been married for 2 years. In name only. Isabel and I have an understanding. The marriage is a legal structure for business purposes. We don't live together. We're not intimate. She has her life. I have mine. It's a contract, not a relationship." "No!" "Then what am I?" Elena had asked, her voice cracking. "What have I been for 3 years? You're everything. You're the woman I love. The woman I want to build a life with. You already built a life with someone else. You married her." "I was pressured. You were pressured?" Elena had stood up, fury finally breaking through the shock. "You're a billionaire CEO who makes decisions that affect millions of people, but you couldn't stand up to your parents? You couldn't be honest with me? I wanted to tell you. So many times I wanted to tell you, but I knew you'd leave, and I couldn't lose you. I thought I could fix it. I thought I could find a way to dissolve the marriage without destroying the business relationships, without causing a scandal. So your plan was what? To marry me too? To be a bigamist? Or were you planning to keep me as a mistress, your dirty little secret, while you maintained your perfect legal marriage to the woman your family chose? God, Elena, no. I was going to divorce Isabel. I still am. Right after the wedding, our wedding, I'll file the papers." Her father has already agreed to adjust the merger terms. It's all arranged. Right after our wedding. Elena had laughed, a harsh sound that held no joy. So I walk down that aisle, say my vows in front of 800 people, commit myself to you forever, all while you're married to someone else. Does that seem romantic to you, Theodore? Does that seem like love? I know how it sounds. Do you? Because it sounds like you wanted to have everything. The socially acceptable wife your family approved of, the business advantages of marrying into the Morrison empire, and me, the woman you actually wanted hidden away until it was convenient to make me official. That's not fair. Fair? Elena had shouted, her composure finally shattering. You've been lying to me for 3 years. Every time you said you loved me, every promise you made, every future we planned, all of it was built on a lie. You were married, Theodore. You are married. And you let me believe I was going to be your wife. Theodore had stood up, reaching for her, but she'd stepped back. Don't touch me. Elena, please. I love you. I made terrible decisions, I know that. I was weak and scared, and I chose wrong, but I'm choosing right now. I'm choosing you. You're choosing me after you've already been married to someone else for 2 years. That's not choosing me, Theodore. That's settling for me after your first choice didn't work out. Isabel was never my choice. She was an obligation. And what am I? Your redemption? The question had hung between them, unanswered. Elena had left that night. She'd packed a bag, ignored Theodore's increasingly desperate pleas, and checked into a hotel under a false name. She turned off her phone and stared at the ceiling for hours, her mind replaying every moment of their relationship through this new, horrible lens. Had any of it been real? Had he ever truly loved her, or had she just been a pleasant escape from his real life? How many times had he left her bed to go home to his wife? The next morning, she turned on her phone to find 87 missed calls and 114 text messages. Most were from Theodore, ranging from apologetic to frantic. But there were also messages from Carolyn, from her own parents. Somehow the news had reached them, from Theodore's assistant, offering to help with anything Elena needed. And one message from an unknown number. We need to talk. Isabel Morrison. Elena had stared at that message for a long time before responding. When and where? They'd met in a private room at an art gallery, surrounded by paintings that probably cost more than Elena's childhood home. Isabel Morrison had been exactly what Elena had expected, beautiful in that polished, perfect way that money could buy, wearing a designer dress that hung on her slim frame like it had been created specifically for her body. But her eyes had been kind, and when she'd spoken, her voice had been gentle. Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would. Why did you want to meet? Elena had asked, too emotionally exhausted for pleasantries. Because Theodore is going to try to convince you that I'm the villain in this story. And I wanted you to know the truth before he rewrites history. So tell me the truth. Isabel had gestured to a bench in front of a massive abstract painting. They'd sat together, 2 women connected by the same man, and Isabel had told her story. Theodore and I were arranged together when I was 21 and he was 25. Our families have been business partners for generations. The marriage made sense on paper, combining resources, strengthening ties, ensuring continued prosperity. We dated for a year because that's what was expected. He proposed because that's what was expected. I said yes because I didn't know how to say no to my father. Elena had listened, seeing her own reflection in Isabel's words. But Theodore was never cruel to me, Isabel had continued. He was kind, considerate. We had comfortable affection, like very good friends who happened to be engaged. When he suggested we actually get married, quietly, legally, just to satisfy our families, I agreed. I thought maybe love would come later with time. Did it? Isabel had smiled sadly. No, we're friends, Elena. That's all we've ever been. We share business interests and family connections, but we've never shared a bed. We've never shared intimate moments. We don't even live in the same building. Our marriage is exactly what Theodore told you, a legal contract. Then why stay married? Because the business implications of divorce would be catastrophic. Not just for our companies, but for thousands of employees whose jobs depend on our partnership. And because honestly, I didn't care enough to fight about it. I have my own life. I date other people. Theodore and I agreed to maintain the legal marriage while living completely separate lives. Until he met me. Until he met you, Isabel had confirmed. And everything changed. He called me 3 years ago, told me he'd fallen in love. Really, truly in love for the first time in his life. Asked me to agree to a divorce. I said yes immediately because I want him to be happy. But our fathers ... She'd paused. Our fathers have been stalling, finding reasons to delay, renegotiating terms, demanding more time to restructure the business agreements. Why are you telling me this? Because Theodore is about to ask you to marry him anyway. To trust that the divorce will happen eventually. And I wanted you to hear from me that he is telling the truth about our marriage being over. He loves you, Elena. He talks about you like you hung the moon. Whatever you decide, I want you to know that I'm not standing in your way. I've already signed the divorce papers. I'm not your enemy. Elena had looked at this woman, this stranger who was legally married to the man Elena loved and had seen only honesty. Do you love him? Elena had asked. Not the way you do. Not the way he loves you, but I care about him. And I care about you even though we've never met. Because anyone who makes Theodore light up the way you do deserves to know the truth. They'd sat in silence for a moment, two women navigating an impossible situation. The wedding is in 3 weeks, Elena had finally said. I know. What would you do, if you were me? Isabel had considered the question carefully. I'd ask myself if I could forgive the lie. Not the marriage, that's a legal complication that will be resolved. But the lie. The 3 years he didn't tell you the truth. If you can forgive that, if you can rebuild trust, then maybe you have a chance. But if you can't, she'd met Elena's eyes. Then you'll spend your whole life wondering what else he's hiding. Elena had gone home back to her small apartment that she'd kept despite Theodore's offers to move her into his penthouse. She'd needed space that was entirely hers, and now she was grateful for that instinct. She'd made lists. Pros and cons, reasons to stay, reasons to leave. But every logical argument had dissolved into the same painful question. How could she marry someone who had lied to her for 3 years? Theodore had appeared at her door on the 3rd day. I'm not leaving until you talk to me, he'd said, looking terrible, unshaven, exhausted, wearing the same clothes he'd worn when she'd left. She'd let him in because she'd needed answers. Did you ever plan to tell me? She'd asked. Or were you hoping I'd never find out? I planned to tell you after the divorce was finalized. I know that sounds like cowardice, and maybe it is. But I didn't want you to carry that weight. I didn't want you to worry about something that was my mistake to fix. You took away my choice. For 3 years, you took away my right to decide whether I could live with your situation. I know. I'm sorry. Sorry isn't enough, Theodore. He'd sat down heavily on her couch, his head in his hands. What do you want from me? Tell me how to fix this. I don't know if you can. They'd talked for hours. He'd explained the business complications, the family pressure, the legal tangles. He'd shown her the divorce papers, already signed by Isabel, waiting only for his father and James Morrison to agree to the modified merger terms. He'd promised that even if it cost him the business, even if it destroyed the family empire, he would choose her. But you didn't choose me, Elena had pointed out. You chose the empire. You married Isabel to keep everyone happy, and then you kept me secret so you could have what you wanted without losing what you'd already gained. That's not. He'd stopped. You're right, I was selfish. I wanted everything, and I convinced myself I could have it all without hurting anyone. I was wrong. What happens to the business if you divorce her before the merger is complete? Theodore had been silent for a long moment. Billions of dollars lost. Probably the dissolution of several partnerships. Massive layoffs across multiple companies. Economic ripples that would affect thousands of families. So you retelling me that our happiness is somehow responsible for thousands of people's livelihoods? No, I'm telling you that my past decisions created impossible complications. But I'll handle them. However long it takes, whatever it costs, I'll fix it. Elena had wanted to believe him. Every cell in her body had wanted to forgive him, to accept his promises, to walk down that aisle and start their life together. But trust, once broken, didn't heal cleanly. The following days had been a blur of increasingly frantic conversations. Theodore's mother had shown up at Elena's apartment with thinly veiled threats about lawsuits and scandals if Elena didn't proceed with the wedding. His father had tried bribery, offering Elena a substantial settlement to overlook this unfortunate complication. Caroline had cried, begging Elena to give up on Theodore, insisting that her brother had made mistakes, but his love was genuine. Elena's own parents had been supportive but confused. Do you still love him? Her mother had asked during a long phone call. Yes. Can you forgive him? Elena had been unable to answer that question. Meanwhile, the wedding machine had continued its relentless march. Fittings for a dress Elena might not wear. Rehearsal dinners with people she might never see again. Seating charts and centerpieces and a cathedral full of flowers for a ceremony that might not happen. Elena had felt like she was watching herself from outside her body, going through motions while her real self screamed silent questions. And then, 1 week before the wedding, she'd received another message from an unknown number. You deserve better than this. They're all using you. There's something you need to know about the merger. Elena had called the number. A woman had answered, someone who'd introduced herself as Lavra Chun, a journalist investigating corporate corruption. I've been looking into the Ashford-Morrison merger, Lavra had explained. There are some irregularities in how it's being structured. Financial manipulations that are technically legal, but ethically questionable. And the marriage, both marriages, yours and Isabel's, are more central to the scheme than you realize. What do you mean? Can we meet? I have documents I need to show you. They'd met in a parking garage like characters in a thriller. Lavra had handed over a folder full of financial documents, legal contracts, and email printouts. The merger isn't just about combining two companies, Lavra had explained. It's about creating a new entity that would have unprecedented control over multiple industries. The marriage between Theodore and Isabel triggers clauses in both their family trust clauses that unlock billions in additional capital. But there's a problem. Isabel's trust has a morality clause. If she's divorced within 5 years of the marriage, her family loses access to those funds. Elena had felt her stomach drop. So Theodore can't divorce her, not for another 3 years. Not without destroying everything. Lavra had pulled out another document. And this is where it gets interesting. Theodore's trust has a similar clause. If he marries someone his parents don't approve of, specifically, someone who doesn't meet certain social and financial criteria, he loses control of his portion of the company. They're trying to push me out. They're trying to make sure you know your place. As a mistress, you'd be tolerated. As a wife, you're a threat. Elena had stared at those documents, seeing her entire relationship reconfigured into a business strategy. Why are you telling me this? Lavra had smiled grimly. Because I'm tired of watching powerful men manipulate the women in their lives. And because I think you're smart enough to do something about it. Elena had spent that night in her apartment, surrounded by documents, piecing together the real story. Theodore had married Isabel because he'd had no choice. His family's wealth and power depended on it. He'd probably truly believed he could eventually divorce her, find a way to restructure the trusts, satisfy everyone's demands. Then he'd met Elena and fallen in love, and suddenly the business arrangement had become a cage. But instead of being honest, he'd tried to have everything. The legal wife who unlocked the money. The secret girlfriend who fulfilled his emotional needs. And eventually, when he couldn't keep Elena hidden anymore, he'd proposed knowing full well that their marriage would either be invalid or would cost him everything. What had he planned? To commit bigamy? To stay married to Isabel indefinitely while pretending to be married to Elena? To drag her into years of legal battles and public scandal? Or had he genuinely believed he could fix it all before the wedding? Elena didn't know. And that uncertainty had been worse than any definitive betrayal. She'd looked at her wedding dress hanging in her closet, white silk and lace, custom designed, breathtakingly beautiful. She'd imagined walking down that cathedral aisle, seeing Theodore's face as she approached, exchanging vows in front of hundreds of witnesses. And she'd felt nothing but hollow sadness. 2 days before the wedding, Elena had made her decision. She called Theodore and arranged to meet him at their favorite restaurant, the tiny place where they had their first date before the world had become complicated. He'd arrived looking hopeful, desperate, terrified. I'm not going to marry you, Elena had said. Simply the color had drained from his face. Elena, not yet, she'd continued. I love you, Theodore. I still love you, despite everything. But I can't marry someone I don't trust. And I don't trust you right now. Tell me how to earn it back. Get divorced. Not in 3 years when the trust matures. Not when it's convenient for business. Now. Hire the best lawyers, restructure whatever needs restructuring, do whatever needs to be done, but end your marriage to Isabel. Show me that you're willing to sacrifice the empire for me. Show me that I'm not just another business decision. The fallout will be terrible, I'm sure. You'll lose money. Your family will be furious. Business relationships will crumble. But Theodore, if you're not willing to lose all of that for me, then you don't love me enough. And I deserve someone who loves me enough. He'd been silent, and in that silence, Elena had seen the truth. He loved her, but he loved his empire more. Or maybe he was just too scared to risk everything, too conditioned by a lifetime of pressure and expectations to make the wild, reckless choice that love sometimes demanded. I need time, he'd finally said. You have 2 days. If you're standing at that altar on Saturday, still married to Isabel, I won't be there. And I won't be waiting for you anymore. She'd left him sitting alone at their table, and she hadn't looked back. The morning of the wedding arrived with brutal sunshine. Elena had woken in her childhood bedroom. She'd gone home to her parents, needing the simplicity of the place where she'd learned to dream. Her mother had brought her coffee and sat on the edge of her bed. Whatever you decide, her mother had said, we support you. You don't owe anyone a performance. Not even yourself. Elena had received no communication from Theodore. No phone calls, no texts, no messages delivered through intermediaries. The silence had told her everything she'd needed to know. He'd chosen the empire, so Elena had chosen herself. She'd showered and styled her hair. She'd applied makeup with a steady hand. And then she de-opened her closet and pulled out the dress she'd de-purchased in secret 2 days earlier, a simple, elegant white dress, nothing like the elaborate wedding gown waiting unused in her apartment. This dress was for her, purchased with her own money, representing her own choices. She'd driven to the cathedral alone, arriving just as the ceremony was beginning. She'd stood at the back, watching Theodore in his immaculate tuxedo, watching Isabel Morrison walk down the aisle in a dress that cost more than most people's cars. Wait, Isabel? Elena had stood frozen, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Isabel Morrison was the bride? Theodore had chosen to marry Isabel publicly, officially, in front of everyone? But then Elena had noticed details that didn't fit. Theodore's expression wasn't one of joy or even resignation, it was blank, carefully controlled. Isabel moved like she was walking to her execution. And in the front row, both sets of parents looked triumphant, satisfied, like generals who'd finally won a long war. This wasn't a wedding. This was a surrender. Elena had felt something shift inside her, a cold, clear understanding. This was the choice Theodore had made. Not because he loved Isabel, but because he'd been too weak to fight. Too afraid to lose his position, his wealth, his family's approval. He was marrying Isabel to keep everyone happy, to preserve the empire, to maintain the status quo. No. And Elena was supposed to what? Disappear? Accept her role as a secret mistress? Wait patiently for years until Theodore found the courage to choose her? No. She'd walked forward, her white dress drawing shocked stares, whispers rippling through the assembled guests. She'd moved down the aisle slowly, deliberately, her eyes locked on Theodore. She'd seen the moment he'd noticed her, the way his face had gone pale, the way his carefully controlled expression had shattered into pure shock and something that looked like horror. Isabel had turned, seen Elena, and in her eyes, Elena had seen understanding, sadness, even apology. Elena had walked until she'd stood level with the front row, close enough to see everything clearly. Close enough to see Theodore's mother go rigid with fury, his father's face darken with anger. Close enough to see Caroline begin to cry. The priest had stopped talking. 800 guests had gone silent. The moment had stretched, infinite and terrible. And Elena had smiled. Not a sad smile. Not a bitter smile. But a genuine, radiant smile that came from someplace deep and true. I'm sorry, she'd said, her voice carrying in the sudden silence. Don't let me interrupt. Please, continue. Theodore had stepped forward off the altar. Elena, no, she'd said simply. You made your choice, Theodore. I'm just here to witness it. This isn't what I wanted, but it's what you chose. There's a difference. She'd turned to look at all the assembled guests, the wealthy, the powerful, the influential people who'd come to witness the merger of two empires through marriage. I hope you're all very happy, Elena had said. I hope this is worth it. And then she'd done something that would be talked about in society circles for decades. She'd laughed. Not a hysterical laugh. Not a heartbroken laugh. But a laugh of pure, liberating relief. Because in that moment, standing in that cathedral full of lies and compromises, Elena had understood something crucial. She was free. Free from the weight of being an Ashford. Free from the pressure to fit into a world that had never wanted her. Free from loving someone who'd loved her but hadn't loved her enough. Free from the person she would have become if she'd stayed smaller, quieter, always compromising herself to fit someone else's vision of who she should be. Theodore had built her a cage of gold and called it love. And she'd almost stepped inside willingly. Thank you, she'd said, looking directly at Theodore. For showing me exactly who you are before I made the biggest mistake of my life. His mother had stood up, fury radiating from every line of her body. Remove this woman immediately. I'm leaving, Elena had said calmly, but first I have a gift. For both of you. She'd pulled an envelope from her purse and placed it on the altar. Lavra-chun sends her regards. That's a copy of the documents she's planning to publish tomorrow about your creative financial arrangements. The way you've structured the trusts, the merger, the marriages, all of it. I thought you might like to read it before the rest of the world does. Theodore's father had gone very pale. You can't, I already did. Lara has everything. The money laundering schemes disguised as investments. The trust manipulations. The way you've been using marriages to circumvent financial regulations. All of it. Elena had looked at Theodore again. I'm not vindictive. I'm not trying to destroy you. But I'm not going to let you bury the truth either. Elena, please, Theodore had begged. Don't do this. I'm not doing anything. You did this, all of you. You created this situation. I'm just making sure everyone knows the truth. She turned to leave, walking back down that aisle with her head high, her white dress brilliant in the stained glass light. Behind her, chaos had erupted, shouted conversations, frantic phone calls, the sound of Theodore calling her name. But Elena had kept walking. Past the shocked guests, past the cathedral doors, into the sunlight that felt like it was welcoming her to a new life. She'd gotten into her car, her old, practical car that she'd bought herself, as she'd driven away from the cathedral, away from Theodore Ashford, away from the person she'd almost become. And she'd smiled the whole way. The truth was, Elena had been planning this moment for exactly 11 days. The night after her meeting with Lavra-chun, after reading those financial documents, after understanding the full scope of the manipulation, Elena had made a decision not to walk away quietly. Not to accept being erased from Theodore's story. And definitely not to simply expose the corruption and disappear. No. Elena had decided to do something far more interesting. She'd decided to win. The day after the cathedral scene, the world exploded. Lavra-chun's article hit every major publication. Simultaneously, a meticulously documented investigation into the Ashford-Morrison financial empire. But it wasn't just an expose of creative accounting and trust manipulations. It was a comprehensive dismantling of two families who'd built their fortunes on carefully maintained illusions. The article revealed everything. The arranged marriage between Theodore and Isabel, the trust clauses that made divorce impossible, the merger contingent on their union, the way both families had structured their wealth to avoid taxes and regulations. But most damaging was the human story woven throughout, a young couple trapped by family expectations, a woman betrayed by the man she loved, and the systemic rot at the heart of dynastic wealth. Elena's name appeared throughout, but not as a victim. Lavra had framed her as the catalyst, the outsider who refused to play by the rules of a rigged game. By noon, the financial markets were in chaos. Ashford Global stock had dropped 23%. Morrison and Associates faced multiple investigations. Both families scrambled to contain the damage, issuing statements that ranged from outraged denial to carefully worded non-apologies. Theodore called Elena's phone 147 times that day. She didn't answer once. But Elena wasn't hiding, she was working. Because what nobody except Carolyn and Laura knew was that Elena had spent the past 11 days doing something remarkable. She'd started building her own empire. It had begun with a single phone call to Victoria Ashford's greatest rival, Diane Hartwell, CEO of Hartwell Industries, a woman who'd been trying to break into Ashford's market share for a decade. Elena had offered her something irresistible. Insider knowledge of Ashford Global's vulnerabilities, upcoming projects, and strategic weaknesses. Why would you help me? Diane had asked, suspicious of easy gifts. Because I know where all the bodies are buried. And I'm tired of men who build empires on the backs of women they underestimate. Diane had understood immediately. They'd met, and Elena had laid out a plan so audacious it had made the veteran CEO laugh with delight. You're not just getting revenge, Diane had said. You're staging a coup. I'm creating an alternative. Let's call it something prettier. Over the next 11 days. Working with Diane's resources and Laura's investigative skills, Elena had systematically contacted every person Theodore and his family had wronged in their climb to power. Competitors they'd crushed, partners they'd betrayed, employees they'd discarded. Women like her, intelligent, ambitious, dismissed because they didn't fit the approved mold. She'd assembled an army. Together, They'd created a new company, Phoenix Collective, a venture capital firm focused on supporting businesses led by women and minorities, particularly those competing in industries dominated by old money dynasties like the Ashfords. Diane Hartwell had provided initial capital. Laura Chun had brought media connections. And Elena had contributed the most valuable asset of all, strategic intelligence about Ashford Global's operations. The company had been registered quietly, its board of directors assembled in secret. They'd been waiting for the perfect moment to announce their existence. The cathedral scene had been that moment. 3 days after the failed wedding, Elena held her first press conference. She stood in front of a room full of reporters, wearing a navy suit that had cost exactly 1/10 of what Theodore used to spend on his ties. Her hair was pulled back, her expression calm, her voice steady. "My name is Elena Winters," she'd begun. "You probably know me as the woman who interrupted a billionaire's wedding. But I am also a business analyst who spent 3 years learning everything about how power really works in this city. And I'm here to tell you that the game is changing." She'd announced Phoenix Collective, its mission, its funding, its board. She'd explained their first initiative, a $50 million fund to support startups competing directly with Ashford Global subsidiaries. She'd outlined their second project, a legal defense fund for employees who'd been wronged by corporate malfeasance and wanted to sue. "I'm not doing this out of revenge," Elena had said, looking directly into the cameras. "I'm doing this because the Theodore Ashfords of the world have been allowed to operate without consequences for too long. They marry women like assets, structure their wealth like weapons, and crush anyone who threatens their position. And we're taught to be grateful for their attention, to feel lucky they chose us, to accept crumbs and call it love." She'd paused, letting the words settle. "I'm done accepting crumbs. And I am offering an alternative to everyone else who's tired of playing a game where the rules are written by people who never wanted us to win." The press conference had gone viral within hours. Hashtag Phoenix Collective had trended globally. Women had shared their own stories of being underestimated, used, discarded by powerful men. The narrative had shifted. Elena wasn't the spurned girlfriend anymore. She was a revolutionary. Theodore had released his own statement that evening, announcing he was stepping down as CEO of Ashford Global, to focus on personal matters and to allow the company to heal from recent turmoil. His father had assumed interim leadership, and the board had gone into crisis mode, but the damage was done. Investors were fleeing, partners were reconsidering relationships. The empire Theodore's family had built over 4 generations was cracking at its foundation. And Elena was just getting started. Caroline had been the first from the Ashford family to reach out. She'd appeared at Elena's new office modest space in a building that didn't try to intimidate, with marble and gold, carrying 2 cups of coffee and an expression of exhausted relief. "I think I'm in love with you," Caroline had said, setting down the coffee. "Not romantically, but as a human being who just watched you burn down everything my family spent generations building, and who can't stop feeling like maybe they deserved it." Elena had smiled. "How's Theodore?" "Destroyed. Completely destroyed. He's been holed up in his apartment for days. Won't talk to anyone except his lawyers. Mom and Dad are furious at him, at you, at everyone. The board is discussing forcing him out permanently. Isabel filed for divorce immediately, by the way. She's getting out while she still can. Good for her." Elena. Caroline had hesitated. "Did you love him, any of it? Or was it all a long game to get here?" It was a fair question. Elena had asked herself the same thing. "I loved him desperately," she'd answered honestly. "Every moment was real for me. Even now, even after everything, there's a part of me that still loves the man I thought he was. But that man doesn't exist. Maybe he never did. Theodore Ashford is a product of his family, his wealth, his expectations. He's not capable of being the person I needed him to be. Are you capable of forgiving him? I don't know. But I know I'm not going to wait around to find out." Caroline had nodded slowly. "For what it's worth, I think you're magnificent. Terrifying, but magnificent. Want a job? Seriously? Phoenix Collective needs someone who understands how old money families operate, their weaknesses, their fears, their secrets. You're an Ashford who's never fit the Ashford mold. That makes you valuable." Caroline had stared at her for a long moment, then had started laughing, the kind of laughter that comes from releasing years of pressure. "My mother is going to have an aneurysm. Is that a yes?" "That's a hell yes." The second person to reach out had been Isabel Morrison. They'd met at the same art gallery where they'd first spoken, in front of the same abstract painting. But this time, Isabel had looked different, lighter, as if she'd put down a weight she'd been carrying for years. "I signed the divorce papers," Isabel had said without preamble. "My father is furious. He's threatening to cut me off, dissolve my trust, make sure I never work in law again. But honestly, I don't care. I'm free. What will you do? I don't know yet. Maybe I'll travel. Maybe I'll start my own firm. Maybe I'll just sit on a beach for 6 months and remember what it feels like to make choices for myself." She turned to Elena. "Thank you? For what?" "For being brave enough to blow it all up. I could never do it. I was too scared, too complicit in the system. But you just walked in there and set fire to everything. It was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Elena had felt an unexpected kinship with this woman. Both of them had loved Theodore in their own ways. Both had been used by the same system. Both had finally found the courage to leave. "Are you angry at me?" Elena had asked. "For the expose? For Phoenix Collective?" "Angry, ungrateful. You gave me an exit strategy I was too cowardly to create for myself." Isabel had smiled. "Though I have to ask, what was with the white dress at the wedding?" "That was a choice." Elena had smiled back. "I wanted them to see exactly what they were losing. And I wanted to look spectacular while walking away. Mission accomplished." They'd stood together for a while, two women who'd been pawns in someone else's game, now finally playing by their own rules. "If you need a lawyer for Phoenix Collective," Isabel had said eventually, "I'm available. And I know where all of my father's bodies are buried too. You're hired." The third and most difficult conversation had been with Theodore himself. He'd shown up at her apartment at 2 a.m, 6 days after the cathedral scene. Elena had been awake, working on Phoenix Collective's expansion plans, and she'd heard him pounding on her door before he'd even rung the bell. She'd considered not answering. But curiosity, or maybe the remnants of love, had made her open the door. He'd looked terrible. Unshaven, disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed from either tears or sleeplessness, or both. He'd been wearing jeans and a t-shirt, and seeing him dressed casually, without the armor of his expensive suits, had made him look heartbreakingly human. "I know you don't want to see me," he'd said immediately. "I know I have no right to be here. But I need to say something, and then I'll leave you alone forever, if that's what you want." Elena had stepped aside, letting him into her apartment. Her small, modest apartment that represented everything she'd chosen over his world. Theodore had stood in her living room, looking lost among her second-hand furniture and thrift store decorations. "I loved you," he'd said finally. "I need you to know that. Everything I told you was true, how you made me feel, what you meant to me, the life I wanted to build with you. All of it was real, but not real enough to choose me over the empire. I was weak. I was scared. I'd spent my entire life being told that the business, the family legacy, the responsibilities I carried, they were more important than my personal happiness, and I believed it. God help me, I believed it." Elena had sat down on her couch, suddenly exhausted. "Why are you here, Theodore?" "Elena, because I made the worst mistake of my life. Because I let my family manipulate me into marrying Isabel when I should have been fighting for you. Because I stood at that altar knowing I was making the wrong choice, and I did it anyway." He'd run his hands through his hair, that familiar gesture of distress. "Because I love you, and I'm hoping against all logic that there's some way to fix this. There isn't. Elena, Theodore, you didn't just lie to me. You made me complicit in something I would never have agreed to if I'd known the truth. You let me fall in love with you while you were married to someone else. You planned a wedding knowing it was either illegal or meaningless. And when I gave you a choice, me or the empire, you chose the empire. I chose wrong. Yes, you did. And now you have to live with that choice." He'd sunk onto her couch, his head in his hands. "I've lost everything. The company, my family's respect, you. Everything I thought defined me is gone." "Maybe that's what you needed," Elena had said, her voice gentler than she'd intended. "Maybe you needed to lose everything to figure out who Theodore Ashford actually is, separate from his family's expectations. Who am I without all of it?" "I don't know. But I hope you figure it out." They'd sat in silence for a long moment. Elena had felt the weight of everything they'd been to each other. The love, the lies, the impossible futures that would never happen. "I'm sorry," Theodore had finally said. "For all of it. For not being brave enough. For hurting you. For wasting 3 years of your life on promises I couldn't keep. You didn't waste them. I learned things I needed to learn. I became someone I needed to become. And I built something that matters. She'd looked at him directly. Phoenix Collective is going to eat your company alive, Theodore. We're going after every market you dominate, every client you depend on, every advantage you've built. I'm going to win, I know. He'd smiled a sad, genuine smile. And I'm glad. Because if anyone can build something better than what we had, it's you. Are you going to fight me? No. I'm going to step aside and let you burn it all down. Because maybe destruction is what we need. Maybe something better can grow from the ashes. He'd stood up then, moving toward her door. But he paused at the threshold. For what it's worth, he'd said. That smile you wore at the cathedral, when you walked away from me, that was the moment I realized I'd lost something irreplaceable. Not the company, not the merger, not my family's approval. You. I lost you. And that's the only thing I actually care about. Goodbye, Theodore. Goodbye, Elena. He'd left. And Elena had locked her door, returned to her couch, and finally allowed herself to cry. Not for what she'd lost, but for what she'd never really had. For the fairy tale that had always been a lie. For the man she'd loved who'd never existed outside her imagination. She'd cried for an hour, mourning the death of her old dreams. And then she'd wiped her tears, made coffee, and gotten back to work. 3 months later, Phoenix Collective was thriving. They'd funded 18 startups, all led by women or minorities, all competing directly with established players in Ashford-dominated industries. Their legal defense fund had taken on 12 cases of corporate misconduct, winning 8 so far. The media loved them. The story of the scorned woman who turned heartbreak into a business revolution was irresistible. Elena had become famous in a way she'd never wanted or expected. She was invited to speak at conferences, quoted in business journals, profiled in magazines that called her everything from avenging angel to dangerous disruptor. She'd been offered book deals, movie rights, podcast appearances. She'd declined most of them, focusing instead on the work. Ashford Global, meanwhile, was hemorrhaging. 3 major clients had switched to Phoenix Collective-funded competitors. 2 board members had resigned. Quarterly earnings had dropped 40%. Theodore's father was still interim CEO, desperately trying to stabilize the company, but the damage was systemic. Theodore himself had disappeared from public life entirely. Rumors placed him in Japan, or Australia, or a monastery in Tibet. Nobody knew for sure, and Elena told herself she didn't care. She was lying. The revelation came on a Tuesday, delivered by Carolyn during their weekly strategy meeting. You need to see this, Carolyn had said, sliding her laptop across the conference table. Elena had looked at the screen. It was a press release from a company she'd never heard of, Meridian Innovations, a new sustainable energy startup. Okay? Elena had said, confused. Look at the founder. Elena had scrolled down to the bio section. And her heart had stopped. Theodore Ashford, founder and CEO of Meridian Innovations. Previously, CEO of Ashford Global Industries. Theodore brings decades of experience in corporate leadership and a newfound commitment to building businesses that prioritize people over profit. He started a company, Elena had whispered. Not just any company. A direct competitor to his family's renewable energy division. Using everything you taught him about ethical business practices, transparent operations, and worker equity, it's brilliant. It's basically Phoenix Collective's philosophy applied to sustainable energy. Elena had kept reading. Meridian Innovations was structured as a B Corp, legally required to balance profit with social good. Employee ownership, environmental responsibility, community investment. Everything Ashford Global pretended to care about but never actually implemented. He's fighting his own family, Elena had said, still trying to process. He's becoming the person you needed him to be, Carolyn had corrected. 3 months too late, but still. Elena had closed the laptop, her mind racing. This changed nothing. Theodore's redemption arc, if that's what this was, didn't undo the lies or the betrayal. It didn't give her back the 3 years she'd spent loving someone who couldn't love her enough. But it meant something. She wasn't sure what, but it meant something. 2 weeks later, Elena received an invitation. Meridian Innovations was hosting a launch event, a small, intimate gathering to announce their first major project. A solar panel manufacturing facility that would employ 200 people in an economically depressed area. The invitation was handwritten on simple cardstock, nothing like the elaborate affairs the Ashfords usually hosted. I would be honored if you would attend. No pressure. No expectations. I just thought you might want to see what you inspired. Theodore Elena had stared at that invitation for 3 days before deciding to go. The launch event was held in the facility itself, a converted warehouse that smelled of fresh paint and possibility. About 50 people were there, mostly employees and local community members. No socialites, no politicians, no people wearing jewelry worth more than cars. Theodore had been in the middle of a conversation with a group of workers when Elena had arrived. He'd seen her, and his expression had transformed surprise, hope, fear, all flashing across his face in rapid succession. He'd excused himself and walked over to her, moving carefully as if she were a wild animal he didn't want to startle. "You came," he'd said. "I was curious. Let me show you around." He'd given her a tour of the facility, explaining the solar panel production process, the worker cooperative structure, the community investment plan. He'd been animated, passionate, alive in a way Elena hadn't seen since the early days of their relationship. "This is impressive," Elena had admitted. "Really impressive. I'm learning. Slowly. Making a lot of mistakes. But I'm trying to build something that won't require lying to the people I love or crushing everyone in my path." They'd ended up on the roof of the facility, looking out at the city as the sun set. The air had been cool, carrying the scent of autumn. "Why did you really invite me?" Elena had asked. "Because I wanted you to see that I heard you. Everything you said about power and privilege and doing better, I heard it, and I'm trying to apply it. Not to win you back," he'd added quickly. "I know that's not possible. But because you were right about all of it." "What happened after the wedding?" Theodore had sighed. "I had a breakdown, a real one. Spent 2 weeks in a psychiatric facility working through everything. Realized I didn't know who I was without my family's approval, without the company, without the version of myself I'd been performing my entire life. And now? Now I'm figuring it out. Building something small and meaningful instead of something massive and hollow. Living in a regular apartment, buying my own groceries, doing laundry. All the normal human things I never learned how to do." Elena had smiled despite herself. "You're doing your own laundry?" "Badly, I turned all my white shirts pink last week. But I'm learning." They'd laughed together, and for a moment, it had felt like old times. Easy. Natural. "Right. I'm proud of you," Elena had said finally. "For this. For choosing to do it differently. I'm proud of you too. Phoenix Collective is changing the game. You're changing the game. We're both building something better. Maybe that's the point. Maybe we had to break each other to become people who could actually build things worth having." Elena had turned to look at him directly. "I forgive you." Theodore had gone very still. "What?" "I forgive you for the lies, for the weakness, for not being who I needed you to be. I forgive you because holding on to anger was taking up space I need for other things. Better things. Elena, but forgiving you doesn't mean I'm coming back. It doesn't mean we get a second chance. It just means I'm letting go of the hurt." He'd nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I understand, and thank you. That's more than I deserve. Probably." They'd stood in silence for a while, two people who'd loved each other badly, learning to let go. "Can we be friends?" Theodore had asked finally. "Eventually? When enough time has passed?" "Maybe. Ask me again in a year." "I will." 1 year later, Elena stood in front of a much larger audience. Phoenix Collective was hosting its annual summit, 3 days of workshops, networking, and celebration for the hundreds of businesses they'd supported. The event had sold out within hours, with a waiting list of over 1,000 people wanting to attend. Elena was giving the keynote address, and she'd dressed in her signature style, professional but not ostentatious, powerful but not intimidating. She'd learned that true power didn't need to announce itself with expensive clothes and luxury brands. "A year ago," she'd begun, her voice carrying through the conference hall, "I walked away from what I thought was my dream. A wedding, a man I loved, a life of comfort and security. I walked away because I realized that the dream was built on lies. Not just the lies he told me, but the lies I told myself about what I deserved and what I was worth." She'd paused, looking out at the sea of faces, mostly women, mostly people of color, mostly people who'd been told they didn't belong in rooms where power was distributed. "I could have disappeared after that. Could have taken a settlement, moved away, rebuilt my life quietly. But I was angry, and I channeled that anger into something productive. I decided that if the system was rigged against people like us, then we needed to build a different system." The applause had been thunderous. "Phoenix Collective started as an act of revenge," Elena had continued. "I won't lie about that. But it became something bigger. It became proof that there are better ways to do business, to build wealth, to exercise power. Ways that don't require crushing the people around you or compromising your humanity. She clicked to the next slide. Statistics showing Phoenix Collective's impact. 237 businesses funded. 15,000 jobs created. 4 major lawsuits won against corporate wrongdoing. 12 Fortune 500 companies forced to change their practices. We did this in 1 year. Imagine what we'll do in 10. The standing ovation had lasted 5 minutes. After her keynote, Elena had been surrounded by people wanting to talk, to thank her, to share their own stories. She'd listened to everyone, shaking hands until her wrist ached, hugging strangers who cried while telling her how Phoenix Collective had changed their lives. And then, in a quiet corner of the conference hall, she'd seen him. Theodore had been standing alone, wearing jeans and a button-down shirt, looking completely out of place among the business casual crowd. He'd been holding a program for the summit, his expression unreadable. Elena had excused herself from her current conversation and walked over. "You came," she'd said. "You said to ask again in a year. About being friends." "I did say that, so I'm asking, can we be friends, Elena?" She'd studied him. He'd looked different, not just his casual clothes, but something in his demeanor. Less polished, more genuine. The armor was gone, replaced by something softer. "How's Meridian Innovations?" she'd asked instead of answering directly. "Growing. We just signed our 5th major contract. Hired our 200th employee. Still not profitable, but we're getting there. And you? How are you?" "Better. Different. I'm in therapy twice a week, which has been illuminating. Learning to separate who I am from who my family wanted me to be. Still working on the laundry situation." Elena had laughed. "Still turning things pink?" "I've graduated to occasionally getting things clean. It's progress." They'd smiled at each other, and Elena had felt something shift. The anger was gone. The hurt had faded. What remained was something gentler, a recognition of shared history, of lessons learned the hard way, of 2 people who'd broken each other and then grown from the breaking. "Yes," she'd said finally. "We can be friends. But Theodore, I need to be clear, this isn't a path back to romance. I'm not waiting for you to prove yourself so we can try again. I've moved on, I've built a life that I love. Friends means friends. I know, and that's all I'm asking for. A chance to know the person you've become. A chance to prove that I can be someone worthy of your friendship, even if I was never worthy of your love. You were worthy of my love. You just weren't ready for it. Maybe. But thank you for saying that." They talked for an hour, catching up on the past year. Theodore had told her about his therapy breakthroughs, his struggles with building a business without his family's resources or connections, his attempts to make amends with the people he'd hurt. Elena had shared Phoenix Collective's plans for expansion, her own journey toward healing, her discovery that she was capable of building an empire without compromising herself. "I saw your interview with Forbes," Theodore had said. "The one where they asked if you'd ever forgive me. Your answer was diplomatic. What did you want me to say?" "I don't know. But I'm glad you didn't say you hated me." "I never hated you, Theodore. I hated what you did. I hated the situation. But you? You were just a flawed human being, like all of us. Making terrible decisions under impossible pressure. That's generous.